So this is film for minimalism. One of the films that was in the running that I did not select as one of my top 10 or even top 20 was the 2009 film No Impact Man. There is, however, an interesting scene in the film where the title character, No Impact Man Colin Bevan, has a discussion with his toddler daughter about consumerism. As he explains to her, a consumer desiring to make an environmentally sound purchase is faced with an extraordinary job, as this can require a great deal of research. In an effort to short-circuit all this, Bevan suggests simply consuming less, a lot less. It's a simple idea. So simple, in fact, that even a toddler can apparently understand it. In a certain way, it also forms the basis of the response to consumerism known as minimalism. In one sense, minimalism is hardly new, as most human beings throughout history have probably gotten by with the bare minimum, or nearly so, needed for life. Even today, for a broad swath of people across the planet, this is likely still true. Hence, we hardly need to prescribe minimalism for most of the people on the planet. But what we are talking about here is voluntary minimalism. Relatively wealthy people who could buy lots of stuff, but choose not to for environmental or other reasons. In that sense, minimalism is a solution to a problem that is at an epidemic level in wealthy countries like the U.S. In America, at least as early as the 19th century, people began amassing stuff as consumer culture began to build momentum. One of the earliest critics of this phenomenon was Henry David Thoreau, who I think can rightly be considered one of the great grandparents of at least American minimalism, as he pondered, the bare minimum necessary for life, and then acted on what he learned during his relatively short Walden experiment. In recent years, minimalism has emerged as a cultural movement designed to counter rampant consumerism. Joshua Fields Milburn and Ryan Nicodemus, featured in the documentary Minimalism, a documentary about the important things, are two leading proponents of the minimalist lifestyle. As this film makes clear, one of the interesting aspects of minimalism is that people are not necessarily adopting this lifestyle for environmental reasons. As Milburn and Nicodemus explain on their website, and quoting them here, minimalism is a tool that can assist you in finding freedom. Freedom from fear, freedom from worry, freedom from overwhelm, freedom from guilt, freedom from depression, freedom from the trappings of the consumer culture we've built our lives around. Real freedom. It's the end of the quote. Many people believe that responding to the climate crisis on a personal level will mean that we have to do without quite a bit, which means that we will have drab lives of deprivation. What's intriguing about minimalism is that this group of individuals has voluntarily decided to do without quite a bit because they believe that this is a better way to live. This was also Thoreau's message. Intriguingly, after experimenting with the life of minimalism, Thoreau, Milburn, Nicodemus, and many others have all confirmed that this is indeed a better life. So, is minimalism an important response to the climate crisis? One thing to consider is No Impact Man Colin Bevan's assertion that simply consuming less is enough. It would be great if it were, in fact, that simple. However, seemingly similar products and practices can have different environmental footprints, especially when considered the energy used to make them, their useful lifespans, the sort of materials of which they are made, the conditions under which they are manufactured, and so forth. You keep going. Hence, it's not enough just to consume less. We need to make sure that we make the right decisions when we do consume. Nonetheless, although minimalism is not an environmental film per se, living a minimalist lifestyle can have significant environmental impact. I'm curious to hear what you think about the film. Is minimalism a viable and meaningful option? While minimalism is a great start, a number of theorists have been considering the next step, Two such thinkers are Juliet Schor in her book True Wealth, How and Why Millions of Americans Are Creating a Time-Rich, Ecologically Light, Small-Scale, High-Satisfaction Economy, and Tim Kasser in The High Price of Materialism. While both books are well worth reading, New Dream has conveniently put together two short videos that nicely introduce both works. Incidentally, New Dream, formerly the Center for a New American Dream, was, as their website explains, founded in 1997 by a group of forward-thinking activists and philanthropists who sought to draw greater attention to the links between individual action, social justice, and the broader environmental impacts, and between excess materialism and negative impacts on human well-being, including children's development. Close quote. In True Wealth, Schor, in many ways, takes a minimalist approach. However, minimalism, from Thoreau through modern minimalists, has largely been a personal choice. Schor considers, what if an entire society took up a similar approach to adopting a new economic model, what she calls a plenitude economy? The idea is simple. People would work less, maybe a lot less, like in the Netherlands, where they work under 30 hours a week, and hence have more time for things that would make their lives better and more rewarding, like growing some of their own food and other DIY projects. They would also have more time for activities that would make them happier. In short, Schor's message is that while personal changes of the minimalist variety, for example, are obviously terrific and absolutely necessary, we also need to think in terms of larger system change, involving the sort of economic and political change that she recommends. Tim Kasser's The High Price of Materialism, and that's both the book and the video snippet from New Dream, considers the impact that materialism in the sense of ramped up consumerism has on our lives. It's not a pretty picture, as materialism makes us less happy and more anxious, depressed, and selfish, for a start. Again, I'm curious to hear what you think. Can we maximize minimalism, so to speak, by building our society and economy on less materialistic values? Would this indeed be better for us and the planet? Could we actually make this happen? In other words, could we get enough people to go along with it to actually reinvent our materialist culture? So, class discussion of minimalism. Note that the following observations, as usual, have not been paraphrased or altered, though I do correct the occasional typo, and because of space concerns, often part of the comment is reproduced here along with my reply. In working through these replies, I will first quote a student's observation, as usual, followed by my thoughts. So, the first quote. The thing that bothered me first was when Joshua Milburn was talking about how his life looked a lot like everybody else's, listing off a lot of things, items and things, quote, closets full of expensive clothes, and how he had a lot less, and he has his chair, his table, his bed, etc. It just came across to me as grossly privileged for him to say that what he has was average, and how his way was less than average, when his apartment is honestly nicer than anything I've ever lived in. Growing up in a home where our house was pretty bare, but not at all by choice, that just didn't sit right with me. And when a man later on said that he was homeless, there's a big difference between traveling and renting homes where you go and not being able to afford a place to live. So again, it just felt grossly privileged. It's the end of the quote. Yeah, this is a wonderful observation that squarely hits on the central point. Minimalism is a movement by and for privileged people. There's no doubt about it. After all, minimalism doesn't make sense for people who have very little, as they may have only essentials in their lives. What's there to give up? Indeed, their lives may well be best characterized by lack rather than abundance. However, for people who have a lot, and by that I mean too much, for example, certain people in wealthy countries like the United States, minimalism makes sense. Unfortunately, the documentary Minimalism does not address this issue in any meaningful way. To the contrary, Milburn and Nicodemus spend a good deal of time portraying themselves as successful before they chose a minimalist lifestyle. This is seemingly done to underscore that their lifestyle is one of choice rather than necessity. In other words, yes, I live like a poor person, but I was once and presumably could again be quite wealthy. Unfortunately, this can be more than a little grating. This is not to say that there is no merit to minimalism. Quite the contrary. From an environmental perspective, since the wealthy countries have largely brought about the climate crisis in the last few decades through, relentless consumption and corresponding greenhouse gas emissions, anything that people in these countries can do to reduce this endless cycle of consuming and emitting should certainly be welcome. Indeed, people in wealthy countries who adopt a minimalist lifestyle could do even more. For example, being a minimalist, you might have either more disposable income as you are buying less new stuff, or more time as you might be working fewer hours in order to buy new stuff. So what about that extra time and money that you have? You could, of course, buy fewer things of higher quality, which would still take as much money. Or you could use the money for other things like purchasing experiences such as travel, or use the time that you have freed up for self-care. But what about donating that money or time to a worthy cause? Again, the documentary Minimalism does not address this possibility in any meaningful way. Consequently, minimalism can, in the documentary, arguably does come across as selfish and self-serving. Of course, it certainly need not be, but again, the documentary does not explore how a person could both directly help themselves and others through a minimalist lifestyle. So the next quote. I remember I watched this film in my economics class in my senior year of high school, and I was left inspired. I wanted to desperately change my way of living. But in the end, I was not successful, mostly because at the time I was living with my parents, and they shut my idea down immediately because to them, minimalism does not exist. I come from a Latinx immigrant family. For my parents, the more things you own, the more it is seen as a form of success. Being able to own a car and buy clothes and materialistic things means that they have succeeded in life. To them, it means that all their hard work has paid off after years of struggling in this country to prove their worth. While I do understand where they are coming from in their reasoning for not wanting to live a minimalist life, there is no way to change their thinking. Close quote. Yeah, another truly excellent point. In wealthy countries like the U.S., we live in a system that measures the worth of a person by how much they consume. Simply put, success is measured in terms of consumption. Hence, if you are a mega successful influencer, your life is characterized by, unbridled consumption. Huge houses and lots of them, fancy cars and lots of them, expensive designer outfits and lots of them, exotic trips and lots of them. Yeah, you get the idea. And social media provides a wonderful opportunity to telegraph your consumption worth to the world. Of course, most people never achieve this level of purchasing power. Nonetheless, we are all encouraged to aspire to consume as much as possible. Maybe just one McMansion and a closet full of fast fashion. But what if you are on the other side of the spectrum and do not have the resources to consume much? Since success and the worth of a person is measured in forms of consumption in this system, such a person would hardly be seen as successful. Indeed, in its most nasty form, we are encouraged to think of such a person as a failure. Of course, as I have suggested, Milburn and Nicodemus spend a good deal of effort convincing us that they were and could again be successful if they chose to be. But not everyone has that confidence. Hence, they need to prove their worth to the world through consumption. Endless consumption. This is how the system works. While some people, like the person who wrote this comment, um, you can choose to opt out of the system. For other people, like their parents, it's not so easy, as the system exerts enormous social pressure on them to assert their worth through consumption, which results, unfortunately, in increased greenhouse gas emissions. But let's be clear, it would be misguided to put the blame on those individuals, as the blame squarely lands on the system itself and the corporations that maintain it. So the next quote: Minimalism, a documentary about the important things, was my favorite movie of the quarter so far. What made me like it so much was the fact that it gave me a breath of fresh air, allowed me to step back and rethink some of my own practices with new ideas of minimalism. I started to ask questions: is this really useful to me for various items in my life? And even prompted me to start getting rid of some of the excess. And that's the end of that quote. As we have seen, there are certainly reasons to be critical of the documentary Minimalism. However, let's stand back and consider the climate crisis for a moment. What's the principal cause of that crisis? It's certainly not most individuals in low to middle income countries. As I've repeatedly noted, the poorest 3 billion people on Earth have only contributed 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions that our species has put into the atmosphere. Rather, the principal cause of the crisis is the minority of people on the planet who live in wealthy countries and who have lifestyles that are utterly unsustainable, as these individuals consume far too much of the planet's resources, which results in staggering greenhouse gas emissions. Ironically and tragically, this unbridled consumption is not achieving what these people desire, which is greater happiness. Let's be very clear about the fact that some of these greenhouse gas emissions come from the United States collectively, rather than being the byproduct of individual action. Excuse me. For things like maintaining a large military and extensive infrastructure like roads, but much of this is expended in order to make the American dream possible for each and every one of us individually. So is there a cure to this sickness? In fact, there is. Here is the prescription: consume less, a lot less. It's seemingly just that simple. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, as many people, like the parents of this person who made the previous comment, will not likely take the prescription. Should we fault them for that? Yeah, certainly not. And why not? Because, as I noted, many of us in wealthy countries are trapped in a system that has yoked our very sense of worth and self with consumption. So in diagnosing this as a personal problem and offering a prescription to cure it, we lose sight of the fact that this is a far larger systemic problem which deeply needs to be changed. Simply put, unbridled consumption and capitalism needs to be severely checked. So how do we go about doing that? Ultimately, by electing a new generation of politicians that will reel in the corporations that are profiting at the expense of us and the planet. And of course, we need a generation of activists to bring this attention to the forefront of the public and consciousness. So, what about this comment that the documentary Minimalism gave a breath of fresh air, allowing me to step back and rethink some of my own practices with new ideas of minimalism? This was, incidentally, hardly the only comment like this, as many people had similar sentiments. Yes, summing up what we have been saying: one, such a comment can only come from a privileged position, and two, given our extraordinary consumer culture, many people will not feel this way, and three, one person's actions are virtually insignificant, given that there are nearly 8 billion people on the planet. So should we not bother with something like minimalism? To the contrary, I am of the decided opinion that rampant consumerism in wealthy countries and the corresponding greenhouse gas emissions needs to be radically minimalized if we are to mitigate the climate crisis. In this sense, people who are now voluntarily minimalizing are harbingers of the future, working out how all of us in wealthy countries will need to live if we are to get through the crisis. Of course, individual action alone doesn't add up to much, but it is a start, especially as it makes clear that another way of life is possible. For many people, this is itself an epiphany, a real insight. So the next quote, minimalist life sounds appealing to me, and I want to start getting into some of the practices that were seen throughout the documentary. I also realized that my very own grandmother has a similar mindset of a minimalist. She lives in Mexico, and sometimes she comes to visit us, but when she does, she always comments that she wouldn't like to live in America because she says she noticed that it seems like everyone here just focuses on materialist things and is money-oriented. She also appreciates the simple things in life and has always made whatever she buys last a long time. I used to not get why she said that about the U.S., but after the documentary, it highlighted all of the things that my grandma was saying, and I agree with her. Wow. That's a close quote, by the way, but boy, what a wonderful comment, which makes clear that minimalism is hardly new, but rather has been a way of life for most people on the planet for most of human history. Well, we might conclude that, isn't that sad for them, but lucky for us that we have so much. But from the revealing and perceptive viewpoint of this person's grandmother, we are not the lucky ones, regardless of what we have been told. From her perspective, in the U.S., quote, everyone here just focuses on materialistic things and is money-oriented, close quote, rather than appreciating the simple things in life. This is not to say the conditions for billions of people across the planet, especially in low to middle income countries, should not be improved. Everyone should have access to clean water and health care, for example. However, converting everyone in the planet into consumers and keeping with the U.S. model would be as disastrous for the planet as it would be for them. Of course, some people, like this person's grandmother, would have the good sense to reject a life of relentless consumerism. But given how successful the U.S. has been at, turning us into a country of consumers, and how successful the project is sweeping across the planet, there is every reason to fear that individuals like this are in the minority. This makes clear that what we are facing here is not just a U.S. problem, but is now a worldwide phenomenon. That the U.S. is, of course, clearly one of the global leaders in consumerism and is part responsible for the successful marketing of it to the world. Next comment. I love that this film's baseline was that less does and can make us more happy. The American dream is a tarnished, outdated, consumerist goal that has not only ruined the planet, but deteriorating our well-being. It was inspiring to hear how people in the world have readjusted their lives, perspectives, and happiness to deconstructing their attachment to material goods. I get chills when the film faded with the saying, "Love people and use things because the opposite never works." It's true. It's devastating that our culture has been built around and conditioned to think that stuff gives us happiness, purpose, or fulfillment. The most important aspect of our lives are our relationships with ourselves and others. True happiness cannot be found from a Black Friday sale or an Instagram ad. Close quote. And again, well said. It's indeed inspiring to hear how people in the film have readjusted their lives, perspectives, and happiness by deconstructing their attachment to material things, which is quite an accomplishment. 150 years ago, Thoreau wrote a book about his own personal journey of deconstructing his attachment to material things. Why is this such an accomplishment? Precisely because, as we have noted, corporations have excelled at turning human beings into consumers. They exert all sorts of pressure in all sorts of ways to make us pine for the material items on offer. This is, of course, what makes materialism so difficult to adopt and to keep as a lifestyle over time. It also gets to the root of the problem, which, as we have noted, is not with individuals, but rather with the corporations that have raised us from a very young age to be rampant consumers. Of course, These corporations would likely tell us that the problem is ultimately with us, as we should simply not buy the things on offer. But this is a rather outlandish position, as they spend billions of dollars every year pressuring us to make these purchases. This also underscores the fact that it is unlikely that that minimalism will become anything like a dominant culture in the United States if we do not address this root problem, which is not with individuals, but with marketers fashioning them into consumers. As with the climate crisis, this will ultimately involve putting politicians into office who are willing to decisively act on this problem. Until then, minimalism is a fascinating grassroots phenomenon trying to work out how to live a more authentic way of life, free of unnecessary things. In this sense, it may be a provocative glimpse into the future. Let's hope. So the next quote, since I already saw minimalism last quarter in English 22, this week I instead watched the alternative videos visualizing a plenitude economy and the high price of materialism. These videos build off the minimalist argument, but on a more societal level. Visualizing a plenitude economy talks about how, following the 2008 financial crisis, Wall Street was thriving while poverty and joblessness were rampant in our society. Their solution was a plenitude economy. Changing how we spend our time is the key to reducing environmental impact, creating more jobs, and making everyone live better lives. They suggest changes such as reducing individual workloads. Instead of hiring 4 full-time employees, hire 5 and have them each work 80%. Excuse me. This is very much in line with the Nordic model, with people working less and having more time for socializing and seeking personal fulfillment. Instead of juicing as many work hours out of employees as they possibly can, these companies instead want their employees to work less in order to be more productive. So that's the end of the quote. Minimalism is largely a personal choice, though one can imagine families adopting it as well. But what would it be like on a larger societal scale? As this person rightly notes, following the 2008 financial crisis, Wall Street was thriving while poverty and joblessness were rampant in our society. In response, scholar Juliet Schur suggests the idea of a plenitude economy, where people would work less, perhaps 4 days a week or for 30 hours or so. This would result in a shrinking of the economy, also known as degrowth, but one that did not bring about joblessness, poverty, and unhappiness, but rather more fulfilling lives, as people would have, to again quote this person, more time for socializing and seeking personal fulfillment. Although this may sound like a theoretical and hence unrealistic idea, as this person rightly notes, this is very much in line with the Nordic model, as countries like the Netherlands and Denmark have largely adapted this approach. For example, I'm quoting here, around 3/4 of people in the Netherlands choose to work part-time, anything from 12 to 36 hours a week. Although the idea of 3/4 of the workforce working part-time may seem almost unthinkable to our American sensibilities, it can and does work in other countries. Amazingly, the per capita income in the Netherlands is just a few percent less than the United States. The reason that I coupled visualizing a plenitude economy with minimalism is that it suggests that by shifting to a different sort of economy, we could, in fact, maximize minimalism, so to speak, by having people work less and instead spend more time learning, having meaningful lives. So the next quote. The high price of materialism mentions how in America today we're told that the good life is the goods life. As we become more materialistic, we suffer more depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and we act less empathetically, generously, and cooperatively, and we stop appreciating ecologically conscious activities. At its core, the video focuses on the points that, 1, we need to understand what causes people to prioritize materialistic lives, and 2, we need to promote intrinsic values, growing as a person, being close to your family and friends, improving the world, for example. We need to spend more time working on ourselves and making sure that our personal values are being reflected in the lives we live. We need to live a life that shows how much we care about the people around us and the world we live in. This really goes hand in hand with the minimalist lifestyle and reminds me of the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk, said that we have everything that we need to be happy right now. Happiness does not come from possessions. It comes from within ourselves, from the people around us, and from being fully present in the interconnectedness of the world, living completely in the moment. That really put the puzzle pieces together for me personally and helped me understand what this is all about. I think that we can get so caught up in living our lives that we find it hard to see the downside of everything. We understand the drawbacks of a problem, but we can't just rip the Band-Aid off and get over it. We know that our obsession with our possessions is toxic, but we can't bring ourselves to throw them away because we know the work that we put into buying them. We know the harm that our behaviors are having on the planet. We can't give them up. It's so easy to feel discouraged with this direction, in the direction of the way the world is headed, and subsequently disillusioned with the suggested changes to our lifestyle that we want to live. Ultimately, though, if we could just be brave enough and strong enough to give new things a try, we could solve our problems so easily. But things aren't that easy. It's not easy to just compromise on everything. It's not easy to give up the things that we feel that we deserve. And it's particularly hard to change our conventions on how we should live our lives every day. But all we can do is to take baby steps and begin to build a life that we feel satisfied with. We need to be the pioneers that the people come after us, be pioneers so that the people come after us can see the benefits of a new world and how to live our lives. Yeah, wow. This comment is so thoughtful and squarely on the mark that I don't really know what more than I could add. All in all, this was a very thoughtful group of responses to the notion that for those of us in wealthy countries who are, again, the principal cause of the crisis, having less of a consumerist lifestyle would not only be better for the planet, but for each of us as well. Yeah.